Hey everyone, I'm working back in the greenhouse today and I'm working on the window stop trim, which is one of the last steps on a window install project for the interior side. And if you recall from previous videos, these window stops were made using old board materials that came from a corn crib. And a lot of those boards were not in awesome shape, but they were still usable wood that could be cut down using a table saw and routed on one edge, so we had a nice eased edge. Window stops fit in more like a box in comparison to how a trim might fit on the wall, where your boards are laid flat on a trim project for like an interior trim, and window stops are laid more like a box pattern. I have my miter saw set up with me already, and it's set to approximately a 45-degree angle. When I'm doing my cuts, I am not moving my blade from one side to the other. I'm doing all of my cuts with my blade in this position because you wouldn't necessarily want your window trim to have a spread angle. Say there was a tiny measure issue. When I'm cutting one side of the corner, I cut it face up, and then the other side will get set in face down. If you don't have a miter saw, there are miter boxes that you can use with a handsaw tool. And I keep this handy because I actually have had to make some hand cuts for this project. So behind me I have my last window, and you can see that it's got the two verticals and I've got the top piece laid out and set aside. I take my board that is set for the left side, and I know that this board is set for my left because it's got the eased edge facing outward. And I come up to the top and I make a mark. I try to keep this as vertical as I can. And I make a mark where the top of the windowsill hits. And this is the mark that I'm going to use to make my cut. For my top board, I went ahead and I cut the miter off on the right side of the window. I'll try to hold it horizontally, and I'll make my mark where the left side of the stud hits. For my right side piece, I've got my mark cut. Now I know what my three pieces that I need to cut to length will be. I could use a tape measure to do these measurements, but for me, when I'm making my cuts, I generally cut just a little bit longer than the pencil length, and I go and I test fit it, and I see exactly where my piece is hitting on the window, and then I can make my final cuts from there. I'll go ahead and I'll start to make my marks on the board. If you're a more experienced woodworker, you may not have to make all the marks that I make, but I find them to be helpful for me because I still need that level of guidance for myself to make sure I don't make mistakes. As you can see on the board, hopefully you can, we've got a rounded edge on this side and a square edge on this side. So I know that the rounded edge is the edge that I want facing outward. And because of that, this particular board, I'm gonna have both of the longest edges are gonna be on the top, and then the shorter edges will be on the bottom. So when I'm making my marks, I need to make sure that that I'm angling in toward the center. I made a mark right here. So now I'm marking on the back side, and this tells me the length that I'm planning to end up with. So my last mark I make is I set my speedy square so that it's angling inward, and I make my mark here. I purposefully cut a little long, so I may have to test fit it and make some other cuts. I'm gonna go ahead and test fit this. Now that I've done my test fit, I am ready to make a final cut across the corner. These pointed corners are really fragile. One trick with doing trim work like this is to round off this top corner piece, so as you're sliding it in and out, that it's not catching on stuff and it doesn't risk tearing the wood. So this is a really quick, just with my knife coming across the top and smoothing out that edge a little bit. Make sure you're cutting away from yourself. Try to keep your hand out of the path of the blade. Usually I'm wearing gloves for this part of it. And the last key is make sure your blade is sharp, because a dull knife is a dangerous knife. So this piece is ready. So the marking on this board is for my right side, so it says S4R, tells me that this is going to be going to the right side. Because it's going on the right side, I know that I'm going to need to cut this with my curved side facing downward. I need to make sure that when I make my marks, that I am preparing myself so that I'm cutting where my inward angle is going to be sloping in toward my softened edge. So again, I'm going to have this faced and positioned so that I'm ready for the cut, but I'm not cutting yet until I make my marks. I'll start with making my mark across the top where I made my pencil mark when I measured before. So now that I've made my horizontal mark, I'm going to now line up that back edge with my speedy square. So the point of my triangle is in alignment with the point of the length of the board. And now I'm going to make my mark for this specific board. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark out my left board and I'm going to cut them both back to back. So as you can see on this time, I've got my eased edge facing upward, so the curved edge. So for my left side, I need to mark on the front side of my board. And again, now that I've got my horizontal line marked, I am ready to place my speedy square. This is what it looks like for me when I'm making my cuts. I'm gonna put my gloves back on. It is freezing out here. We're supposed to get a snowstorm, hence all the extra gear that I have on today. Okay, so now it's time to test fit those boards. So this first one is going to be tested on the left side. And it feels nice and tight. And my cut on the right side feels a little more tense than I'd like for it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and take this piece back out and I'm going to trim it just a little bit to get that fine-tuned in. My last step is going to be to round off these corners and then we're going to be ready to install. So I have my tube of caulking here, and I've run a bead of caulking all the way up, across the top, and down the side, part of the side. And I do this caulking before I set the window stops on. I like this as a little bit of a glue, and it helps seal some of the cracks that were too small for me to put foam into. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the caulking to the rest of the side of the window. Then I'm going to put the trim pieces in, and then you'll get to see what it looks like when I'm installing them. Doesn't have to be too perfect, but especially since this part of the window had foam on it already. So I always start with the sides first, and like we had talked about before, I am using the eased edge as the inside front-facing piece. So this is, it's got my angle up and to the right, and so I know that this is my right-hand side piece. I just press it into the caulking a little bit, and that kind of holds it in place while I'm still placing the other pieces. This is my left-hand side piece. And when I'm pushing both back toward the stud and toward the window, trying to seal some of those gaps. The last piece is up high. I'm short. I'm gonna need a ladder. And now I'm ready to nail these pieces in place. I usually do about 5 nails per side and about 3 to 4 nails across the top. And that's as simple as it is. Of course, it's 17 windows in here, so you have to take this times 17 windows, but figured I'd show you. This was the very last window for me to finish installing the window stops, and I thought I'd show you how they look now. Here's a look at the window stop trim all installed across all of the windows. If you have tips or tricks that you use for these kinds of projects, feel free to leave a comment below.